He was humiliated in front of dozens, called slow, unfit, and suspicious, all because of the color of his skin. They mocked his limp, questioned his presence in first class, and treated him like a threat instead of a traveler. But what none of them knew was that the man they pushed around was the one person they should never have touched. This wasn't just another case of racial profiling. This was a mistake that would cost careers, expose a hidden power, and flip everything they thought they knew upside down. The story you're about to witness is more than a flight gone wrong. It's a reckoning. A reminder that dignity can be quiet, but justice never stays silent. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more true justice stories, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and which part of this journey shook you the most? Theron Mayfield moved through the TSA checkpoint with the slow, measured steps of a man accustomed to enduring pain without showing it. His right leg, stiff from an old injury, dragged slightly behind the left with each step, and his back held a gentle curve that made his frame seem smaller than it was. The terminal was humming with the usual morning urgency, rushing footsteps, the drone of flight announcements, the rolling of suitcases on tile. He kept his head low, not out of shame, but out of habit, the quiet dignity of someone who preferred not to be seen if it meant avoiding conflict. But that morning, conflict came for him anyway. As he reached the final checkpoint, placing his tray of belongings on the conveyor belt, a voice cut through the terminal's clamor like a shot. The agent at the scanner, Chet Rowley, lifted his hand high and clapped once, loud and theatrical. "Hey now, pick up the pace, Grandpa. We got Real travelers trying to catch planes behind you." The line of passengers stilled for a beat, then snickers echoed behind him. Theron didn't react. He picked up his shoes and coat, slipped his belt back through the loops with quiet efficiency. As he reached for his passport, it slipped from the tray and landed flat on the floor. He bent to retrieve it, steadying himself with one hand on his knee. In that pause, Chet took a casual step forward and nudged his boot against Theron's shin. Not hard enough to bruise, but pointed, deliberate. He leaned down just enough for those around him to hear, and muttered how that kind of slowness was typical of someone whose reflexes belonged in a clinic, not an airport. That's the kind of lag you see in folks who don't know if it's 1998 or 2030. Several people behind Theron chuckled. A young man in a business suit covered his mouth, whispering something to his companion, who nodded while scanning Theron's coat and shoes like inspecting a thrift store donation. The woman in line directly behind Theron stepped sideways to avoid standing too close, her gaze darting toward the gate as if proximity to him would delay her departure. Chet straightened up, reached for Theron's boarding pass, and held it between two fingers like it might contaminate him. He turned it over, glanced at the flight information, then looked at Theron and smiled. A slow, crooked thing. "First class, huh?" he said to no one in particular. "We got a high roller here. Hope the champagne's not too bubbly for you up there." Someone behind them let out a wheezing laugh, followed by the sound of a hand smacking another in amusement. Theron didn't respond. He took his boarding pass back, slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, and walked forward. Chet leaned toward the agent at the adjacent station and said something low. The agent didn't laugh, just offered a tight-lipped nod, but the message was clear. This was theater, not security. A performance meant to show who held the power and who didn't belong. Theron found an empty seat at the edge of the gate's waiting area, away from the windows, away from the crowd. He eased himself down slowly, the worn joints in his knees grinding silently beneath the weight of his frame. He folded his hands over his boarding pass and rested them on his lap. Across from him, a mother whispered something to her daughter, and the girl turned her eyes briefly toward him before giggling and turning away. A custodian pushing a mop paused just long enough to glance down, then kept moving. Theron sat still. He was used to that kind of silence, the kind that wasn't just quiet, it was the intentional act of ignoring. Behind his stillness, his thoughts churned. There had been no mistake. His pass was valid. His seat was assigned. His money had cleared. But somehow, that wasn't enough. Somehow, to men like Chet, he was still just a misplaced body in a space meant for someone shinier, younger, whiter. He reached into his coat and touched the edge of a worn leather notebook tucked inside. It was old, older than his injury, older than the hate in Chet's smile, and inside it were names. Not contacts, not allies, witnesses. Years of names and dates and places where something like this happened and passed quietly into memory. Around him, time moved with the mechanical rhythm of airport life. But for him, every tick stretched just a little longer. He hadn't moved since the incident at the checkpoint. He knew Chet Rowley was still nearby. And he also knew that men like Chet didn't let things go easily. Sure enough, minutes before the flight began pre-boarding for Group A, Chet reappeared. This time walking with exaggerated purpose, flanked by a younger agent and gesturing toward Theron with that same smug confidence, as if he were dragging an unwelcome dog away from the dining room carpet. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for a random secondary screening," Chet announced, though it was clear to anyone within earshot that the screening was anything but random. Theron rose slowly, his knee stiff, the familiar creak in his bones met with a disapproving shake of the head from Chet, who was already reaching for his gloves. "Just making sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't," he said, snapping the latex across his wrist with theatrical flair. As Theron stood still with arms slightly outstretched, Chet began patting him down, starting with the shoulders and working lower with unnecessary thoroughness. When his hand brushed against Theron's right hand, which trembled slightly from a nerve injury sustained years ago, Chet paused, held the arm higher than needed, and smirked. "Got a bit of a twitch there, huh? You on something?" He looked to the younger agent for agreement, who shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Chet continued, "Or maybe it's the early signs. You know, they say those hands start to shake right before the mind goes. Used to see it in my uncle before we had to put him somewhere padded." Theron said nothing. He kept his gaze straight ahead, not even flinching when Chet gripped his wrist just a little tighter, pretending to check for something that didn't exist. The older man's silence seemed to frustrate Chet, who leaned closer and added, "You people always think the rules don't apply. You carry yourselves like the world owes you something, and when it doesn't, suddenly everything's unfair." Theron's fingers tightened briefly at his side, the only crack in an otherwise calm shell. The younger agent beside Chet finally cleared his throat, shifting nervously, but didn't intervene. Just as the inspection was about to conclude, Theron coughed, just once, dry, from the chill in the terminal's air conditioning. But Chet latched onto it instantly. He stepped back, dramatically raising both hands, turning to the nearby passengers and loudly remarking, "That's just great. I better sanitize, don't want to take home a surprise. Some of these folks walk around sick and think a ticket gives them the right to breathe on everyone." He removed a small spray bottle from his belt and misted the air around Theron, faking a cough of his own, drawing a few confused laughs from onlookers who couldn't quite decide whether this was serious or some twisted attempt at humor. Theron lowered his hand slowly and said nothing, but his posture had changed. It wasn't broken, it was bracing. Chet wasn't finished. After signaling the secondary screen was complete, he gestured toward a staff corridor behind the check-in area and told Theron they'd have to verify something with the airline. When Theron hesitated, Chet put a hand on his back, not pushing, but guiding with enough force to leave no room for refusal. The hallway was sterile, beige walls and fluorescent lights humming above. Chet walked behind Theron now, his tone more relaxed, more personal. "You know, I saw a guy like you once in Vegas. Dressed nice, talk smooth. Turns out he was sleeping in his car outside the casino. You can polish a boot, but it's still a boot, you know?" Theron stopped walking. He turned slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet Chet's. There was no anger, only recognition. Not of Chet, but of the moment. One he'd lived 1,000 ways in 100 different places. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That silence, once again, unsettled Chet. The officer tapped his radio but didn't say anything, then led Theron back toward the terminal without further delay. Outside the corridor, a few passengers had taken notice of the exchange. One woman narrowed her eyes as she watched Theron pass, her brows creasing with uncertainty. The younger TSA agent followed behind, now visibly uncomfortable. As Theron was finally allowed to return to the gate, Chet offered one last comment under his breath, just loud enough for Theron to hear, but soft enough to shield himself from accountability. The gate agent made the final call for first-class boarding, and the moment Theron stood, a murmur passed through the line like static through wire. He moved without rush, his steps just as deliberate as before, his presence quiet yet unmissable. As he approached the boarding tunnel, Chet reappeared. His voice was less theatrical this time, but no less venomous. He motioned to another TSA agent, Mitch Travers, younger, broader, and with a smugness that mirrored Chet's perfectly. Mitch stepped forward as Theron was about to hand his pass to the airline scanner. "Wait 1 second. Sir, we've had a report," Chet said flatly, signaling to the agent manning the scanner. "Something concerning was just brought to our attention." Theron paused, but his face remained unchanged. Chet folded his arms and nodded toward a middle-aged woman standing several feet away, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed and uncertain. She wouldn't meet Theron's gaze directly, but she gestured subtly toward him when prompted. According to her, Chet said with mock politeness, there was inappropriate staring, potential harassment. Flight rules are clear. We can't allow any behavior that might make other passengers uncomfortable, especially in first class. The announcement, made just loudly enough to carry across the nearby boarding area, caused heads to turn. Passengers already in line shifted uneasily, looking between Theron and the TSA officers like watching a scene unfold in slow motion. Theron didn't flinch. He glanced at the woman again, whose eyes darted away instantly, her expression caught between guilt and compliance. Without asking for permission, Chet motioned Theron to step aside into the aisle beside the boarding gate. Mitch joined him and stood just a step behind Theron's left shoulder, too close to be casual. "Sir, go ahead and place your belongings on the ground," Chet instructed, "and raise your hands where we can see them. We're going to do a brief behavioral observation screening." Theron lowered his coat to the floor, folded his hands calmly, then lifted them shoulder-high. The terminal traffic behind him continued as normal, but a few travelers paused long enough to observe the display. A young couple whispered as they walked past, and a teenager in a hoodie angled his phone subtly toward the scene, capturing video with the detached curiosity of someone scrolling through moments he'd never understand. Mitch made a show of circling Theron slowly, scanning him from every angle like sizing up a threat. As he reached Theron's back, he placed a firm hand on his shoulder and leaned in close, speaking loud enough for Chet to hear, but pretending it was private. "You know the type," Mitch muttered. "This is the guy who probably sits in coffee shops all day, pretending to read while watching women over the top of the paper. Gets kicked out, complains about society being unfair, always someone else's fault." He squeezed Theron's shoulder once and laughed under his breath. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp, surgical in its cruelty. Chet added his own layer, turning toward the scanning agent and shaking his head. Classic. This is what happens when someone mistakes an upgrade for a license to act above their class. Theron stood motionless through it all. He neither objected nor defended himself. There was no protest, no indignation, only the quiet presence of someone who had endured this particular brand of humiliation too many times to count. His dignity was stripped not by what they accused him of, but by how confidently they treated it as truth, how easily the narrative was shaped without evidence, and how quickly the crowd was willing to believe it. Eventually, Chet nodded as if satisfied. "We won't pursue charges at this time," he declared, and Mitch stepped back. "But we'll be watching, just so we're clear. You so much as breathe wrong in the air, we'll be waiting when you land." The message was clear. Every step Theron took from that moment on would be observed, scrutinized, interpreted through a lens already fogged by bias. He picked up his coat, placed the boarding pass back in his pocket, and walked past them without a word. The scanner beeped as his ticket was approved. The airline employee gave a tight, forced smile, but didn't make eye contact. As Theron disappeared into the jet bridge, Chet turned to Mitch and grinned. People like that always think silence means they've won. But silence is just the first sign of surrender. Mitch chuckled in agreement. Or guilt. Inside the narrow tunnel leading to the aircraft, the air grew heavier with each step, but Theron didn't falter. His posture was unchanged, chin level, stride slow but deliberate. At the aircraft door, a uniformed attendant gave him a brief glance and gestured without warmth toward the galley. Before he could proceed, another figure emerged. Chet again, like a ghost refusing to stay buried. He had bypassed the standard entry process, clearly called ahead or arranged access through some back channel, and now stood at the entry with a clipboard, fake authority dripping from his every movement. "There's been an internal order," he announced coldly, motioning Theron toward the wall beside the cockpit. "We need one more layer of security clearance." The pilot and crew did not interfere. No one asked questions. They watched, some curiously, others with trained disinterest, as Chet led Theron into a narrow service alcove just off the boarding path. Once inside, under the sharp fluorescent lighting that highlighted every wrinkle and imperfection, Chet pulled a small flashlight from his belt and crossed his arms. "Let's make this easy," he said. "Remove your coat, shoes again, and shirt. Need to make sure you're not concealing anything under all that vintage fabric." Theron hesitated for a second, not out of fear, but calculation. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't procedure. It was spectacle. Still, he complied. First the coat, folded neatly and placed on a bench. Then the shoes, worn leather, scuffed but clean. Finally, the shirt, his fingers slow but precise, buttons undone with the care of a man who had learned long ago that even gestures could be used against him. Underneath, he wore a faded gray undershirt, thin and frayed around the collar. It revealed a wiry frame, weathered by time but still upright. On his right shoulder, a scar, a jagged line of old tissue, caught the light. Without invitation, Chet stepped forward and tugged the sleeve lower to expose it fully. His breath caught for a second. Then the smirk returned. "Military, huh?" he said, loud enough for a nearby passenger to glance over. "Let me guess. Special ops? Maybe one of those shadow assignments?" He laughed, hollow and condescending. "Not every soldier comes back a hero," he added. "Some come back bitter, broken, still pretending they matter." Theron didn't flinch. The scar wasn't a secret. It wasn't shameful. But in that moment, it became a weapon turned against him. The space around them began to fill as boarding continued. Passengers passed by the alcove, some stealing glances, others slowing their steps, drawn to the quiet performance of a man standing half undressed under scrutiny. Chet made no effort to shield Theron's privacy. In fact, he shifted position deliberately so the man's frame, marked by age and history, stood in full view of the cabin's front row. A child stared openly before being tugged along by his mother. An older man shook his head and muttered something inaudible. Even the flight attendants began to whisper behind the curtain. Chet's tone turned mocking. "You really thought first class was the place for you? With that limp, that look, those shoes?" He circled Theron slowly, gaze inspecting, breath heavy with self-satisfaction. Maybe once years ago, before time caught up. But not now. Not today. Today, you're just another old story no one wants to hear again. Mitch appeared beside him moments later, holding a small scanning wand. His presence added weight to the scene. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Together, they conducted the most invasive pat-down yet. Palms against ribs, around the waistband, across the collarbone. At no point was a weapon or forbidden object discovered, yet neither man stopped. Chet gestured toward the visible scar again. "We should mark this in the report," he said, "might be related to some prior trauma. We've seen cases where guys like him get unstable midair. PTSD, rage, regret. You know the kind." Mitch nodded blankly, his eyes not on Theron, but on the passengers now slowing at the curtain, watching as the performance dragged on. Theron kept his eyes forward, his arms lowered slightly, not in defeat, but because the moment no longer deserved ceremony. His stillness became an anchor, refusing to let their words shape his worth. After several long minutes, Chet stepped back and crossed his arms again. "That'll do. You can get dressed now, though if it were up to me, we'd have rerouted you to a behavioral holding room. Consider yourself lucky." Theron dressed in silence, every motion deliberate, as though reclaiming each piece of himself stitch by stitch. He did not respond. He did not ask why. He did not offer resistance or compliance. He simply existed, a quiet presence in the eye of a storm made to shame him. When he emerged from the alcove, fully dressed once more, the passengers parted without instruction. Some avoided his gaze. Others looked straight through him. First-class passengers settled into their plush seats. Flight attendants moved with curated grace, and the door to the jet bridge remained open just long enough for another insult to step through. From behind the curtain at the aircraft's entrance came a burst of light chatter and perfume, followed by the arrival of a white woman in her late 20s, draped in designer travelwear, pulling a pale pink carry-on. She walked confidently, the kind of passenger used to being seen, but not questioned. As she approached, one of the crew members offered a warm smile and gestured toward her seat, which happened to be across the aisle from Theron's. The woman nodded graciously, adjusted her scarf, and took her place without delay, not even a glance toward the boarding agent or security staff. No ID check, no scanning wand, no additional scrutiny. She passed through the same space where Theron had been stripped of his shirt and forced to relive a war wound in front of strangers. And yet for her, it was a moment of effortless transition. Theron noted it silently. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was deliberate. It was engineered. The flight crew offered her champagne before the wheels even rolled, pouring the drink with a practiced elegance that seemed scripted. And yet when Theron politely raised a hand to request water, his presence was met with a pause, a glance, a quiet hesitation, as if the request came with subtext. Before his drink arrived, Chet's voice returned, not from a memory this time, but from a cabin entrance, where he stood whispering to the purser. His eyes flicked toward Theron more than once. A few seconds later, he moved into the cabin and made his way directly toward seat 2A. Theron's posture remained unchanged, his gaze still on the tarmac, but he sensed Chet's presence before the man spoke. "There's been another alert," Chet said casually. "We'll need you to step off the plane for a moment." Theron turned slightly, his face calm but firm. "What's the issue?" he asked, keeping his tone level. Chet offered a dismissive smile and explained it was part of an enhanced screening cycle, something random, standard, nothing to worry about. He gestured back toward the jet bridge with a lazy hand, as if guiding a child who had lost their way. Behind them, a few heads turned. The white woman across the aisle arched an eyebrow in curiosity, but quickly returned to scrolling her phone. Theron stood once again, gripping the armrest before rising, his body reluctant not from fatigue, but from the knowledge that dignity had limits, and his were being tested. As he stepped off the aircraft, Mitch joined them outside the cabin. Theron was now surrounded once more, boxed in between two uniforms, neither of whom acknowledged the disparity between his treatment and that of the woman who had walked through one challenged minutes earlier. In the corridor, he asked again, quietly but firmly, what exactly prompted the additional check. Chet grinned. "Sometimes folks like you forget the rules," he said, "and we just like to make sure everybody understands them the same way. It's not personal, it's just policy. If you'd like, we can get someone to explain the protocol slowly, maybe even in writing, something easier for your generation to follow." He chuckled to himself. "Or better yet, want us to call someone from assisted services? They've got staff trained to walk people through steps like these." Theron didn't respond. He didn't nod, didn't glare, didn't offer the silence of compliance or resistance. He simply stood there, a monument carved from patience and resolve. But inside, something shifted. Not rage, not defeat, precision, focus, calculation. It wasn't just about Chet anymore. It was about a system that operated with the confidence of tradition, one that didn't need approval to function, because it had become invisible through repetition. The most dangerous prejudice wasn't the kind that shouted. It was the kind that spoke softly, framed as policy, performed with a smile. Moments later, a crew supervisor appeared with a clipboard and a tense expression. He didn't speak to Theron directly. Instead, he addressed Chet and Mitch, who nodded and muttered back. After a short exchange, the supervisor turned to Theron and motioned toward the aircraft. "You're clear to board now, sir," he said. "Thank you for your patience." No apology, no acknowledgement, just clearance, as if access itself were a favor, not a right already earned. Theron nodded once and stepped past them, back into the plane, back into a seat he had never left willingly. As he sat down, the white woman next to him looked over and asked, "Everything okay?" Her tone was light, but her eyes betrayed curiosity, even suspicion. Theron didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. Some questions aren't asked for understanding, they're asked for affirmation. And he owed none. The flight crew resumed their checks, and the doors closed with a final hiss. It was Mitch, his uniform now stiff with pretended purpose, holding a tablet and flanked by another airline representative whose badge read Security Liaison. The man avoided direct eye contact, instead tapping something quietly on the screen and whispering to Mitch, who then stepped forward and told Theron there had been a procedural escalation. This time it wasn't random, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a matter of federal compliance, an order handed down that required a discreet interview prior to takeoff. Theron did not speak. He unbuckled the seatbelt slowly, stood again for the fourth time that hour, and walked the tight corridor of the first-class cabin, with Mitch walking behind and the liaison ahead. No one in the cabin spoke up. No one asked questions. The woman across the aisle pulled her blanket up to her chin and looked away. The door to the jet bridge opened for them alone. As the rest of the plane sat in pre-departure silence, Theron was quietly removed. They didn't take him far, just down a hallway behind the terminal's outer edge, into a room clearly not built for passengers. It had no windows, no posters, no smiling signs about loyalty points or travel upgrades. The walls were dull gray. The lights hummed with a fluorescent buzz, and the air smelled faintly of metal and antiseptic. The camera above the door was unplugged, the wire intentionally severed, curled like a loose snake above the frame. Inside, two chairs faced each other. Chet was already waiting. Mitch stood by the door, arms crossed, his stance deliberately casual. Another staffer stood with a tablet, clearly positioned not to record but to look official. When Theron entered, no one gestured to the seat, but he sat anyway, posture straight, coat still buttoned, eyes unwavering. Chet leaned forward with both forearms on the table, a grin growing slowly across his face, no longer needing to perform for the public, no longer acting under the veil of professionalism. What he said next didn't require witnesses. It required only ears that could listen and a target that couldn't respond. "You know, someone like you shouldn't even make it past check-in," he began, voice low, deliberate, laced with a satisfaction that had fermented into cruelty. "You dragged down the entire environment. This terminal is built for experience, for image, for people who belong in first class, not relics. Every time someone like you walks through, it cheapens the space. It reminds the real clients that we've let the system slip." His words were unfiltered now, pouring out like poison from a leak he no longer cared to seal. "It's not personal," he continued. "You just don't fit. Not in the seats. Not in the lounges. Not even in the narrative." Mitch smirked from the corner, arms still crossed, nodding in agreement. Chet went on, stating how customers like Theron made others uncomfortable, not because of behavior, but because of what he represented: age, color, resistance. He claimed that passengers had standards, that this wasn't about law or fairness, but about perception. If people looked around and saw someone who reminded them of discomfort, of struggle, of class shifts they didn't want to acknowledge, it ruined the experience. "This airport sells an illusion," he said, "and you're the crack in the glass." The staffer with the tablet said nothing. His face remained blank, but his eyes flickered when Chet leaned in closer and muttered that some men should know when their time is up. Theron remained still. His breath was calm, his chest rising and falling with quiet control. But inside, the silence was no longer passive. It was tactical. They had taken everything they could: his seat, his time, his privacy, his dignity. And now they wanted submission, not in words, but in posture. They wanted the slouch of defeat. They wanted to break something invisible. And yet he gave them nothing. No flinch, no shift, no fire, just presence. That presence unnerved Chet more than a scream ever could. After several minutes of continued taunts, layered insults, and whispered justifications of discrimination dressed in corporate language, Chet stood and signaled Mitch. "Escort him back," he said. "No charges. Yet. Just make sure he knows he's being watched." Theron stood slowly, still silent, and followed Mitch out of the room. As he passed the threshold, he glanced once, only once, back at the unplugged camera above the door. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. Mitch walked a step behind him, and the return to the gate was silent. No passengers saw this part. No passengers saw the moment where an old man was caged by words rather than walls, punished not for what he did, but for where he sat, for how he stood, for the skin he lived in and the silence he refused to surrender. When Theron reached the plane again, the first-class door reopened briefly, and he stepped back into the aisle like nothing had happened. His seat remained empty, the coat folded over the back, untouched. It wasn't the absence of words, but the weight of them still suspended in the cabin air. To his left, the curtain to the galley remained half open, revealing shadows of crew members whispering behind it. Every so often, one of them would glance toward him, not with concern, with caution. At the other end of the first-class aisle, Mitch stood speaking in hushed tones with a man in a black vest, holding a portable scanner and nodding toward Theron's overhead compartment. Chet was no longer in view. He hadn't returned since the isolation room, but his fingerprints were still everywhere. In the way Mitch watched Theron, in the stiffness of the attendant's smile, in the tension that hovered over seat 2A like an invisible no-fly zone. What none of them knew, what not a single one of them suspected, was that Theron had already taken a step they had failed to anticipate. Before he was escorted into the off-camera room, before Chet confiscated his phone under the pretense of an electronic interference check, he had pressed one button. It had been muscle memory. No hesitation. A call not placed but transmitted. No sound, no confirmation screen, just a vibration deep inside the phone's body as it locked in the emergency signal. A signal routed not to family, not to airline support, not even to the airport's operations tower, but to a secure node buried in the architecture of an agency that didn't advertise its name on doors. And now, as the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude and the crew shifted into autopilot routine, that signal was already moving. It wasn't just alerting, it was identifying. Theron sat perfectly still, but behind the silence, the wheels had started to turn. Systems were activating. Profiles were matching. Clearances were being reviewed. The man they had mocked, stripped, isolated, and dismissed was no ordinary traveler. But they were about to find out. Back in the galley, Mitch reached up and pulled Theron's bag from the overhead bin. The bag wasn't heavy. It was simple, plain black leather with no external branding, the kind of bag easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. But as Mitch opened it and began rummaging, a shift passed across his face. At first, it was curiosity, then recognition, then panic. He paused, blinked, then reached into the inner lining and retrieved something encased in a slim titanium sheath. It looked like a badge, but it wasn't. It had no agency name, no number, no photograph, just a single embedded strip of polished circuitry along the edge and a triangular insignia burned into the surface with a serial code below it. Mitch held it for a second, confusion melting into dread. He turned to the vest-wearing staffer behind him and whispered urgently. The man pulled a phone from his waistband, snapped a picture of the badge, and walked swiftly out of view. Theron remained still, but his eyes were now half-lidded, tracking the peripheral commotion with quiet precision. He knew the protocol. He knew what would happen next. Not to him, but to them. Mitch returned to the cabin with a forced smile, carrying the bag like it now contained live ammunition. He placed it back into the overhead bin and tried to avoid eye contact, but it was too late. Theron's gaze had already met his, and Mitch looked away first. 30 seconds later, a subtle chime echoed from the cockpit, one not meant for passengers. The cabin crew straightened, their movements suddenly sharper. One of them knocked softly on the pilot door and passed in a note. The captain read it, blinked, then leaned back and reached for a handset embedded in the console. Far below the aircraft, encrypted channels began buzzing. A private air marshal team had just received clearance from a federal server they had never interacted with before. 3 levels of airport command security began quietly rerouting resources toward the plane's scheduled arrival gate. And in Washington, D.C., a name lit up on a red-line clearance list under a header labeled Emergency Intermediary Protocols. The name was Theron A. Mayfield. On board, Mitch walked briskly back toward the galley. His composure was slipping. He stopped by the purser station, whispered something, and both crew members exchanged a look of disbelief. Chet reappeared at that moment from the service stairs, his face smug, unaware of what Mitch had just seen. As he approached, Mitch pulled him aside, opened the photo on his phone, and held it low. Chet scoffed at first. Then his expression changed. His smirk faded, his brow furrowed, and finally he stopped moving. Chet stared at the image for a few seconds in silence. He looked toward seat 2A. Theron sat exactly as he had before. Nothing had changed, except everything had. Mitch hissed, "What the hell did we just do?" Chet didn't answer. He was too busy calculating how much trouble they might be in and how little of it they were ready for. The plane's captain received a second message, this time from ground command. Secure priority status. Prepare for landing escort. Inside, Theron Mayfield remained in seat 2A, composed as ever, his eyes watching the movement outside through the slim window. The moment the pilot received final clearance from the tower, a second directive was relayed via encrypted channel to ground control. Hold the aircraft. Secure the entry. Await command escort. No passengers were informed. No announcement was made, but tension crept into the cabin like a fog. The flight attendants moved less smoothly now, their motions more mechanical, their glances more frequent, particularly toward Theron. Chet had gone completely silent since Mitch showed him the badge image. He had returned to the crew station, but hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. Mitch, equally pale, was seated on a side jump seat pretending to check emergency equipment, but his eyes remained locked on the forward cabin like a man awaiting a sentence. Then the air bridge attached. The door hissed open, and no one moved. Instead of the usual gate agent with a clipboard and a bored expression, the first figure to step onto the plane was a woman in a Navy tactical suit bearing no insignia, flanked by 2 men in dark coats. Their posture was military, their eyes sharp, and when they crossed the threshold, the entire cabin seemed to contract. One of them produced a tablet, scanned the cabin, then nodded once. She stepped forward. "Is Theron A. Mayfield present?" Her voice was calm but undeniable. Heads turned. A few passengers instinctively looked toward the back of the plane. But in 2A, Theron simply raised his eyes and met hers. The woman stopped 3 steps short, then spoke a title. Not Mr., not Sir. A designation none of the passengers recognized, a term that made Mitch swallow hard and caused Chet to physically step back into the galley. The kind of title used only in internal communiques and classified briefings. The kind that didn't belong in airports. The woman inclined her head respectfully and extended a folder. "Sir, protocol has been activated. We're here to escort you as directed. A car is ready. The private suite is secured. The operation is green." Theron stood with the same quiet grace he'd shown all day. He gathered his bag without rush, adjusted his coat, and nodded. The woman turned, leading him off the plane without another word. No applause, no explanation, just exit. Passengers whispered among themselves, confusion mounting as the unthinkable unfolded silently before them. At the threshold of the jet bridge, Mitch tried to open his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Chet looked as though he'd swallowed glass. One of the suited men stopped beside them briefly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't touch them. He simply said, "You'll want to stay available for questioning. A team is already reviewing your activity logs. No need to return to duty today." Then he walked away. Within minutes, the federal team moved with clockwork precision. Inside the terminal, the operations director had already received the subpoena. All surveillance footage covering Checkpoint D, Lounge G, and Gate 42B was being downloaded directly to a federal server. Staff logs were seized. Communication records flagged. Within the hour, names would be pulled. Statements would be taken. The system that had functioned comfortably under the illusion of routine had just been pierced, and the wound would not heal quietly. In the VIP terminal adjacent to the runway, a convoy of vehicles now waited behind secure doors. Theron was ushered into a glass-walled suite overlooking the airfield, where another official, this one bearing a higher clearance badge, stood to greet him. "Welcome back, Director," he said, his voice lower, more formal. "We've prepared the briefing room and re-established the secure line. Your next transport is ready when you are." Theron offered a nod and placed his bag on the chair beside him. Then he turned toward the window, watching as the aircraft he had arrived on was wheeled away, disconnected from its ordinary gate rotation. The truth had surfaced. Not in a confrontation, not in anger, but through protocol, through order, through power that didn't need to shout to be heard. The handlers moved efficiently, retrieving his documents, verifying clearances, rerouting the next stage of his travel. There would be no delays, no apologies, no excuses. What had happened on that flight would now exist in a file. What would happen next would exist in careers. Because Theron Mayfield wasn't just a name on a boarding pass. He was an asset, a former intelligence intermediary, a strategic handler with embedded field authority, grandfathered into a protection protocol that superseded regional enforcement and local command. And for the first time in years, the system that had failed to recognize him would now be forced to reckon with the consequences. The federal liaison who had greeted him returned with a printed packet. "Sir, we've already initiated internal review." Security supervisors stood shoulder to shoulder reviewing real-time video footage of the events at Gate 42B, their eyes fixed on scenes that now played like damning evidence in a courtroom. Chet Rowley forcing Theron to remove his shirt, Mitch Travers laughing behind him, the casual disregard for procedure, the weaponization of bias. Each moment, once normalized, now became a line item in a federal report under urgent review. At the personnel wing near Terminal D, Chet was summoned to a conference room under the guise of compliance debrief, but the second he walked in, his badge access was terminated. A security officer waited by the exit. A federal liaison stood at the table, arms crossed, holding a manila folder thick with printed transcripts and time-stamped images. "You are no longer authorized to perform duty under the agency's contract," the liaison said plainly. "You are hereby suspended pending investigation and are to vacate the premises immediately." Chet scoffed at first, still wearing the arrogance he had cultivated over a decade of unchecked authority. But then he saw the folder. It wasn't just about Theron. Inside were written statements, 6 of them, anonymous but precise. 6 different travelers across 3 airports, all recounting similar patterns: racial profiling, unnecessary secondary screenings, personal insults, power used as a weapon rather than a shield. Some testimonies had video. Some included internal complaints that were conveniently dismissed at the time. All of them pointed to a pattern, a habit. A man who had spent 12 years perfecting the art of institutional cruelty beneath a cloak of regulation. And now the cloak was gone. When Chet tried to speak, the liaison raised a hand. "We're not here to argue. We're here to document. You'll be contacted by legal counsel within 72 hours. You are to remain within state lines until cleared by review." Chet turned toward the security officer, suddenly aware that the cameras in the room were now active and recording. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. He walked out, but his posture had changed. The cockiness had drained from his spine. His stride had lost its command. Meanwhile, Mitch had sensed the shift even earlier and had already left the gate area. He was in a service corridor near baggage processing, one hand gripping his phone, the other adjusting his uniform, hoping to disappear into the back end of the airport like a shadow retreating before sunrise. But the plan fell apart when 2 plainclothes agents intercepted him near the elevator. He tried to brush past them, claiming he had been reassigned to a ground crew inspection. One of them showed credentials. The other read his name aloud. He stopped walking. "Sir, we'd like to ask you a few questions regarding a passenger interaction recorded today, as well as several others." Mitch said nothing. He considered running. But before he could even process that fantasy, another voice joined from behind. A woman in civilian clothing holding a tablet. She tapped it twice and rotated the screen. On it was a freeze frame of Mitch gripping Theron's shoulder, his face half laughing, half taunting. Another tap brought up a second image. Different airport, same expression, same posture, another black traveler in a secondary screening line. "We believe you've been involved in multiple incidents," she said, "and we have formal complaints corroborated by timestamps and internal communications. You are not under arrest at this time, but you are being retained for review." His badge was taken. His access was revoked. He was escorted to a holding office near the Customs Department. The look on his face was no longer confused. It was cornered. In the broader network of airport administration, emails were flooding inboxes from regulatory boards, internal audits, federal oversight divisions. The name Theron Mayfield was now marked in red across every secure log, not as a threat, but as a test, one that had just exposed how fragile the illusion of fairness really was. By the afternoon, a full compliance freeze was issued on the TSA sector responsible for Checkpoint D. All staff were pulled from duty. Media had not yet caught wind, but insiders were already preparing for the fallout. Whistleblowers emerged within the hour. A young officer, previously silenced, submitted a report stating that she had flagged Chet's misconduct 2 years ago, but was told to focus on her lane. Now she had receipts, screenshots, memos. Another staffer provided email threads where Mitch laughed about targeting certain passengers because they looked like they'd caused problems. The machine had turned on its own engineers. As evening fell, press releases were drafted. Words like integrity, transparency, zero tolerance were carefully arranged to form a damage control script. But behind the scenes, fear had replaced protocol. At a distant office in Virginia, a senior director scrolled through Theron's personnel archive, heavily redacted, but glowing with clearance seals, embedded contacts, mission oversight, and a designation no one wanted to admit still held power. Active Consultant, National Security Liaison. This hadn't just been a mistake. It had been a reckoning. And it was only beginning. Meanwhile, in the executive lounge of the airport, where Theron had been quietly relocated, a new boarding pass was delivered to his seat. No airline logo, no destination listed. Just a flight number only recognizable to those who had once worked above the civilian level. He thanked the attendant. Weeks had passed since the incident that reshaped the internal workings of an entire airport security division and left a permanent mark on the federal oversight system. In that time, investigations had been completed, verdicts had been handed down, and the veil that once protected unchecked authority had been torn away. The names of Chet Rowley and Mitch Travers had surfaced not only in disciplinary records, but also in public discourse. First through whispers in policy circles, then in national coverage once the agency released an unprecedented transparency statement. While Mitch chose silence, lawyers, denials, long delays, Chet made a different decision. Following his formal termination, a process that stripped him of clearance, pension eligibility, and status, Chet disappeared from the public spotlight. For several days, no one knew where he had gone. But then he resurfaced. Not on the news, not in court, but at a rural community center in Wyoming, where he quietly began volunteering with a local youth reform initiative, a place where young men, many of them white, many of them lost, came to find structure, purpose, and in some cases, someone willing to tell them the truth without shame. Chet didn't enter with authority. He entered with burden, and that made all the difference. He stood in rooms filled with skepticism and tried to explain the things no one had explained to him when he was younger. The weight of unchecked power, the ease of cruelty when hidden behind rules, the poison of superiority disguised as protocol. He never asked for sympathy. He didn't present himself as redeemed, but he spoke plainly, often beginning with a sentence that had haunted him since the day Theron Mayfield walked off that plane. "I thought I was in control until I realized I was just another man hiding behind a badge." At first, only a few listened, but stories of gravity, and the deeper Chet went into the details of his own fall, his casual abuse of power, his subtle dehumanization of strangers, his eagerness to punish without cause, the more his words started to pierce something deeper. He spoke about Theron not as a victim, but as a mirror, a reflection of everything he had refused to face in himself. He admitted to feeling disgust at Theron's silence, not because it showed weakness, but because it showed strength Chet didn't understand. And then, after months of reflection, he received an invitation. It came not from the government, not from the airport, not from any court. It came from the Hill Foundation, a civil rights initiative chaired by none other than Theron Mayfield himself, operating under a new, quietly restored identity tied to national community reform. The invitation was simple: speak, not on behalf of the guilty, not as a warning, but as a man who had been forced to see and had chosen not to look away. The event was held in a repurposed civic theater in Atlanta, filled with activists, scholars, veterans, and community leaders. It was quiet at first. Chet walked onto the stage in plain clothes, no uniform, no podium. He carried nothing but a piece of paper he never looked at. He began not with his name, but with an acknowledgement. I stood where too many still stand, and I looked at justice like it was the enemy. He didn't plead for forgiveness. He didn't perform regret. Instead, he offered account. He named what he had done. He admitted the ease with which he had once laughed at complaints, dismissed pain, and used policy like a shield. And then, toward the end, he turned toward the front row. Theron Mayfield sat there, calm as always, his posture unchanged, his eyes still steady. For a moment, Chet froze. The crowd had gone silent. He swallowed, then stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "I don't know what I expected you to do," he said, "but what you did, staying silent, refusing to lower yourself to anger, that broke me more than any punishment ever could. You held the mirror. I saw myself, and I hated what I saw." He bowed his head not as a gesture for applause, but as a gesture for truth. The room remained silent. Then Theron stood, not for drama, not for closure. He offered a single nod. No handshake, no words, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that said everything. Afterward, the story didn't go viral. No hashtags, no breaking news, but it filtered through the right channels. Other officers began reaching out to the foundation. A new training module was developed, required viewing for federal screening agents. It was called the Mayfield Protocol. Theron never appeared in the videos. His face never became a symbol, but his silence became a lesson. Not passive, not cowardly, powerful, decisive. A silence that had demanded attention, not submission. In time, both Chet and Mitch became footnotes to a larger shift, an internal reckoning that continued reshaping the cultural DNA of airport security and federal training programs across the country. But for Theron, the story didn't end there. He continued to travel, though always alone, always quiet. He never requested special treatment. He rarely revealed who he was. But sometimes, at certain checkpoints, officers would pause when they saw his name. And sometimes, not always, one of them would nod with quiet respect. They never said why, and Theron never asked, because he already knew. Injustice, when left unspoken, festers. But when seen, when confronted, when held in the open, even for a moment, it has no place to hide. And in that moment, justice begins. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a powerful narrative like this one. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Theron's journey struck you the most? Was it the silent strength, the turning point, or the final moment of redemption? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and join the conversation.